and first and foremost being communication skills. And what schools are looking at, two overarching sort of issues from the interview. They want to know, are you a good fit for our program? And, you know, obviously your application helps schools understand that to some degree, to a large degree, I suppose. And they want sort of confirmation of that from the interviewer, whomever the interviewer or interviewers might be. And also, for a lot of schools, they're very interested in getting a second, an opinion on whether they really think you're going to attend. So you really do need to address both of those issues in a broad sense for the interview. And again, and I think I said this in the previous webinars, it might be that Harvard and Stanford worry less about the will you attend piece, because they're at the very top of the tree, as it were, in terms of where people aspire to attend. But nevertheless, a lot of schools are very concerned about this issue, because obviously you, as a candidate, you apply to 4 or 5 different schools, and the schools worry about their yield. So they want to know that the people they admit have a good chance of actually wanting to attend. So those two sort of very broad issues are going to come to place. Okay, come to play. So what are the different types of interviews that you may face? In the first instance, some schools allow for open interviews. So anyone in the application process, or even those that haven't actually applied yet, can interview. And I would suggest, and this is probably more targeted to people applying in the second rounds and so forth, that if you're considering a school that has an open interview policy, Tuck immediately comes to mind, but they're certainly not the only ones that do this. That you should go for the open interview if you possibly can. Obviously, if you're located in a very remote region and it's difficult to get to Hanover in the case of Tuck, then it might be reasonable in your case not to go for the open interview. But if you can go for the open interview, and if it's offered by the schools, then it sends a good signal, smart signal to the school that you're interested in, committed, and so forth. If you don't accept the open interview, you may still obviously be invited for an interview, but you sort of have that little sort of negative, as it were, that you're running against, that maybe you weren't so committed, especially if you're from New York, for instance, and you're applying to Tuck and you didn't adopt an open or select the open interview. So open versus invited. If the open is available and it's reasonable for you to attend an open interview, then you should absolutely do it. There's no reason why you don't do that. The only other issue with open interviews is, because sometimes you're interviewing prior to you've written the applications, that you really need to make sure that you're very firm on being able to answer some of these questions. Because, you know, quite honestly, it's easy to answer these questions, the interview questions, once you've written your applications, because you thought long and hard about this stuff. So just be careful in that regard. Okay, so the next sort of types of interviews is blind versus non-blind. And this is the case where, does the interviewer know your application, i.e. non-blind, versus does the interviewer interview you completely fresh, maybe just with your resume in front of them. And some schools like Harvard, I believe, Stern and MIT, and possibly 1 or 2 more, they use a non-blind interview. And the interviewer will either have read in detail your application or have notes from your application, and will be asking more detailed questions based on what they learned about you in the application. So I call that kind of an iterative sort of interview process. They're learning more about you than they can learn directly from your application. Whereas the blind interview, which quite frankly is an easier interview process for the schools, and it can involve more alumni in their interview process with the blind interview, it just becomes another data point, like your essays and various other media that are part of the application process. So most schools use blind interviews. Some schools, like again Harvard, MIT, and Stern, I think, and whatever you use, non-blind interviews. Resume-based versus behavioral. So what it used to be quite clearly defined. Some schools were more resume-based. Some schools use more behavioral type questions where they really want to ask you about past experiences, how you responded in those past experiences, with the idea that past experiences are the best predictor of future, of your future, right? So that's the idea behind behavioral interviews, sort of introduced into the MBA admission space by MIT Sloan. And they're probably most known for the behavioral interviews, but I'd say most interviews you go through now will involve a bit of resume-based sort of questioning. You know, tell us about, you know, your career to date and what you've done, that sort of line of questioning, why MBA, why now, and so on and so forth. And behavioral questioning. So you'll get a mix of both, where they'll ask you about prior experiences, leadership experiences, and so forth, and situations. So they're anecdotally based questions rather than hypothetical questions, which, you know, anyone can try to figure out how to best answer a hypothetical question, whereas a behavioral question, we really look to you providing past experiences as indicators of the future. Team activities as part of the different types of interviews. Again, Wharton and Ross will be the top schools that do this. And case presentation, London Business School makes you do a 5-minute case, which is very interesting. So those are some of the twists we'll get to later in the webinar. Okay, so the different interviewers that you may face, and some of the what that might mean is you may face AdCom as an interviewer. So that would be like myself. When I was at Wharton, I was part of the AdCom admissions committee, and a lot of my role was to interview candidates. So as an AdCom, I'm on the admissions committee. So you could say that as an AdCom interview potentially has the most impact on your application, because the person interviewing you is potentially in the room when your candidacy is being discussed, if your application goes to the admissions committee, and so on and so forth. And I would also say as AdCom, because we do the most interviews, like I've interviewed thousands of candidates probably in my 7-year stint at Wharton, because of that, we're probably the most consistent in terms of our interview style, and understanding the interview process, right? So that's the advantages, I guess, of interviewing with AdCom. With alumni, I would say that's at the other end of the scale in terms of the least consistent. And some schools are better with their alumni interviewing process than others. But what you find is if you're interviewing with an alum, whilst you may have done a bunch of research on interviewing with that particular school and their interview style and so on and so forth, you might sit down with an alum who suddenly has 3 hours to chat with you, and whereas the standard interview should be 30 to 45 minutes. So you've to react and respond to some inconsistencies when alumni are used. And some schools, you know, like Columbia, and you don't have any choice. For the most part, you're going to interview with alums. So, but I would say that as you're interviewing with alums, just be prepared to go off piste, as it were, in terms of the interview itself. Don't get flustered. Just, you know, you're applying to a top school. It's fantastic. You're obviously clearly a successful person, so make the most of that. And I'd say students sort of fall somewhere in between. A lot of the sort of student interviewers are actually part of the AdCom in some respect. They have direct training, or I mean, alumni have some kind of training, one would hope, but the students would have more recent direct training and so on and so forth, and supervised by the AdCom, etc. So they fall somewhere in the middle. Obviously, when you're interviewing with students, you can get a better perspective of what's currently going on at the school at that time. It's fantastic. Alumni can give you maybe a better perspective of what's going on in sort of what the school can do for your career and so forth. And AdCom, like myself, we don't know as much about this stuff. So you have to take that into consideration. Let me just pause real quick Audio is still fine. Video is still fine. Can you just throw into chat if that's the case? Yes. I saw one response. Okay, very good. Okay. Let me then continue. And here we go. All right. Some other options that you may be faced with in terms of your interview choice might be location. Where should you interview? There are basically 4 choices. Not that every school offers you 4 choices, but 4 choices nonetheless across schools. Interview on campus, interview in hub cities. So some schools will travel after the round 1 or the round deadlines to do their interviewing in different parts of the world, and obviously travel to the major cities like London, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and certainly in Asia, and so on and so forth. Hub cities. Elsewhere, some schools you can just interview wherever you are with a local alum. And if none of those options are available to you, there might be through Skype. So some schools, I think some of the California schools do actually quite a lot of their interviewing directly with students using Skype if you can't make it on campus. I would suggest, if the school offers on-campus interviews, and oddly not every school does, right? So that option might not be as available, let's say at Columbia and at Kellogg, if you're local, for instance, as it would be for quite a lot of other programs. But if you can interview on campus, certainly if you've not visited before, I would say you absolutely should be doing that. And again, it has some signal value, right? So it shows that you're interested and you're more committed to the school if you take that option. The hub cities is a good option if you've already visited campus. And obviously the schools puts a lot of resources itself in conducting these hub city interviews, and it's typically through their AdCom that are traveling. So you should be able to take advantage of that. And especially, again, if you, during the interview, you can make it quite clear that you've already been to Boston or wherever the school is located. Philadelphia, right, for Wharton. Elsewhere with alumni is a decent option, but again, if on campus is available, that's preferred pretty much in any case over elsewhere with alumni. And that would, again, be the same with Skype. On campus would be preferred over Skype, but certainly Skype is doable for those in more remote locations. So schools understand that for sure. Okay, so that's interview location. What do we have next? Interview preparation. So how do you prepare for the interviews themselves? My first point is pretty obvious and pretty silly, but very important, right? Know your application. And again, back to those of you that are interviewing in that sort of open interview format, you might not have actually written your applications, but hopefully you've really thought long and hard about this stuff. But if you've already written your applications and you've been invited for an interview, which is the majority of candidates, then one of the best ways to prepare is to reread those essays, reread your data forms and, and various other aspects of your application. So you know your story in terms of the story that you've presented to the school, because that's the story that, you know, in the context that your interview will be measured against, and so on and so forth for the overall application review. And obviously, if you're going for a non-blind interview, so you're interviewing at Harvard or MIT and so forth, then this is really, really important that you know your application, because you might just get straight out asked about a certain point that you addressed in your application. And it could turn out that, you know, 2/3 of your interview is based on this one narrow aspect of your application, right? So absolutely know your application. I think it's a very, very good way to just prepare for your interview. Know your resume, know the whys and the whats in terms of any decision that you've made, i.e. your choice of college, your choice of undergrad, choice of major, you know why you made those choices, you know what you got out of them, And the same with your career progression since undergrad. You know why you chose to go into consulting or investment banking or tech or something completely different, which is fantastic. And the key experiences from those choices and what you learned from them. So really understand the whys and the wherefores behind the decisions that you've made. And, you know, a simple way to do all this stuff is write this stuff down, right? So when you write stuff down, you tend to remember it a little bit more than if you just sort of remembering it and so forth. Know the school's interview process, and that's obviously very important interview preparation. So if the school conducts blind interviews versus non-blind, that has some implications. Although again, even in a sort of non-blind interview, you'll still be asked questions that maybe you've addressed in your application, like maybe, you know, what are your goals after the MBA and so forth. But know the school's interview process. And, you know, as a tangent, obviously Clear Admit has some fantastic interview archive. So you can go to the interview link on our site and do a search for the school that you're interviewing at, and you'll see, you know, dozens and dozens of interview reports from prior candidates. So that's a great way to do some preparation right there. So know the school's interview process, the types of questions they generally ask. Know why you are planning to pursue an MBA. So this is really important. Obviously, you should know this because you're planning to invest a couple of $100,000 if you're doing a 2-year MBA into your education. So you should know why you're planning to do that, and you'll be asked questions related to that in the interview. So have focused goals is essentially the point there. Identify 4 or 5 anecdotes, the most impactful anecdotes that you've been involved in, I guess, to address common interview questions and the interview questions that we'll talk about in a minute in terms of leadership, failures, strengths, weaknesses, you know, those kinds of things. So you want to identify those anecdotes ahead of the interview, so you're not having to think on the fly. And you want to be able to prepare structured answers to those questions without looking overly prepared, right? So it's kind of like a bit of a fine balance, but preparation is really important in these cases. So identify the anecdotes that you maybe you've already addressed them in the essays, right? So draw them out. You might have to draw from the same anecdotes in the interview, or MIT might ask you, you know, we read about this in this essay, that's fantastic, but give us another example, right? So they're known sometimes to do that. So they want sometimes an example that just has not been addressed to date. So it's more of an additive interview in that case. Arrive early to your interview. Don't let timing stress you out. Try to get there, you know, a good 15, 20 minutes early. If you can, if you're interviewing on campus, plan a visit to the campus, sitting in on the class or whatever it is, actually before the interview is conducted. That would be very good. Gives you some fresh material to address in the interview, and shows again to the interviewer how keen and focused you are on the program. Bring 2 copies of your resume. One for sure give to the interviewer, or offer it up even if they don't request it. It's quite useful. And another tip I'd say about the resume itself, as someone that, again, I interviewed lots of people, and what you would find sometimes AdCom, more so than the other interviewers, but we would interview maybe 10 candidates in a day, especially if we're doing interviews on hub cities. So we'd start at 8:30 in the morning, go through till 5 o'clock. That's interviewing a lot of people. When you put your resume together in these cases, I actually really liked it if at the top there was a summary statement, like an objective, like sometimes you have on CVs and resumes. But this summary statement made it very clear why you're getting an MBA and what your goals are post-MBA. Because that's going to be part of the interview question that I would have for the candidate. If the candidate's got it nicely written down, it's a good reminder to me when I end up doing my interview write-up, right? So I would, for an interview resume, absolutely include my goals directly at the top. Just like in a job resume, you might have an objective at the top to say, this is the sort of job I'm seeking. But don't make your goals on your interview resume saying, I'm seeking a top MBA, and leave it at that, because that's just adding no value to the interviewer. But it's, I'm seeking an MBA, or you can even skip that bit of the phraseology, but you say, my goal is to, I want to start some kind of firm in 10 years time, and in the short term, I want to do X, Y, and Z, and this is sort of based on what I've done and why it all makes sense. So that kind of statement, quite good on top of your resume. Dress well. You want to be, some people say, oh, do I have to wear a suit? Do I have to look smart? All this stuff. And it's like, I think, you do want to look smart, but you also want to be comfortable in what you're wearing. So make sure that you look good as well as look smart. That's good. And then be engaged in the interview. That's also very, very important. Okay, so that's some of the interview preparation. And again, if you have any questions as we're going along, or if stuff's not quite clear and you want me to go over some additional stuff, throw it out there in the Q&A or in the chat, and Mike will hopefully gladly interrupt me, and I can address those points. So what we'll do now for the next 10 slides or 11 slides, I think, is go over some of the more common questions that you will face in the interviews. So some of these questions will be more so in a blind interview versus non-blind, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, these are the types of questions that will most likely come up. Okay. I just checked the chat. I didn't see anything in there to answer directly. So probably one of the most common questions that you'll face is a simple question like, walk me through your resume. And it seems very innocuous, very easy question. You have a resume, it's very easy for me to articulate, and so on and so forth. But you really want to be prepared to answer this question so that you're not fluffing around all over the place, you're not rambling and so on and so forth. You want to come up with maybe a 2 or 3 minute summary. And what you want to realize is this summary is basically going to set up the remainder of the interview. So potentially the interviewer is going to be listening very astutely to then circle back to some of the things that you raised during this 2 or 3 minute summary, right? So because it's going to get asked at the beginning of the interview, it really sets the standard for the entire interview, as well as provides content for the interviewer then to push for further insight. So it's a super important aspect of your interview.
Alex,
yes.
We have a question regarding anecdotes, and should they be more comical, or should it be more about the story? So when you're kind of injecting those types of things, what are your recommendations on the tone?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about humor. So when I talk about anecdote, I'm talking about experiences in the past that will highlight certain attributes and traits that are important for business schools. So maybe there's an experience that really highlights your leadership. And we'll talk about the leadership question in a minute. Or maybe there's an experience that highlights a failure in which you were involved, and you do absolutely need to prepare this anecdote that you learned from the failure and grew from it, and maybe there was a subsequent experience where clearly your learning from the failure shows because you grew from it. But that's what I mean by anecdotes, coming up with these experiences that you've had in the past that clearly demonstrate attributes about yourself, your leadership, and your emotional intelligence, and various other things that the AdCom is seeking to learn. They want to learn by your prior experiences, and that's what I mean by that. And the majority of these anecdotes are going to come from your professional experience, but it doesn't have to be that all your anecdotes come from a professional experience. You could be doing some interesting things in your extracurricular life whilst you're in college, or more so now, volunteering and so forth. And we know that top schools really look at these sorts of activities to help sort of, find the top performers. So sometimes anecdotes from outside of work can help too. But yeah, anecdotes are going to be very important, but they are basically situations in which you were involved that really highlight attributes about you that schools are really interested in learning. So very good question. Yeah, don't worry about just trying to be funny. That could actually backfire. Although having a little humor in the right place is good. Really highlights good communication skills, I suppose. And as a side note, I don't know if Wharton still does it, but they started a comedy club when I was worked at the Wharton School, and I had the privilege of actually performing in their comedy club. So it's a fantastic experience. But you do cool things like that when you're at these schools. So anyway, so the walk me through your resume. Very important question, sets the tone for a lot of subsequent questioning potentially for the interview. Explain your decisions. Again, outline your growths and your learning. So why you went to this school, what you got out of it, why you chose that major, why you chose to go work for company X, and the growth, the promotion, the transition to another company, why you made those transitions, and so on and so forth. Why you're going to business school and what you're sort of planning, although there's a more detailed goals question most likely going to follow anyway. But it's good to address that even succinctly at the end of your walk me through your resume piece. And you can draw on a variety of experiences. You can also talk about sort of your out of work activities and so forth, the things that you've decided to get involved in. And hopefully these are things about which you are passionate. That is key to outside of work activities. Be passionate about them. Don't be just doing them because you know that's what you're supposed to do to get into business school. So for me, if I was applying to top tier school and I was never smart enough to do it myself, but all my passion would be aligned with horses and some of my work I've done on horse welfare issues, for example. So it sets up the remainder of the interview. You might be asked, instead of walk me through your resume, a related question is tell me about yourself. And that's a similar question. So you would do the same sort of preparation for that question. Okay, what are your career goals? So schools really want to know this. And it's really important to come across as someone that's really thoughtful, knows why they're going to the particular school. And there's actually another question we'll talk about in a minute in that regard. But why they're planning now to quit their really cool job, whatever it might be, to spend a couple of years out of work to then go back into work and so on and so forth. You might have had to address this directly in essays, might even have been a data form question. It might also get asked in the interview. And you want to convince the interviewer that you know why you're doing this. So be clear, be detailed. You should know the sort of company you want to work with as you're first starting out after the MBA. You might have one or two options for the type of company or for the company name and so on and so forth. But you should know this stuff. So make sure that is clear. Be ambitious in your long-term goals. So remembering that business schools sort of, their overall reputation to a large extent is based on the quality of their alumni and what their alumni are doing 10 years and 20 years out. So you need to show that you're going to be part of that high caliber alumni network. So be ambitious, but be realistic. So you want to make sure that you yourself have the credentials that will set you up with the MBA from that particular school to execute on your ambitious long-term goals. But don't go into the MBA, let's say, with some experience in human resources or marketing or something like that, which is very good in and of itself. But then say you're coming out and you're planning to go directly into private equity, because that wouldn't be being realistic. In the most cases, I'm sure someone could come up with a scenario where it's realistic, but nevertheless, you need to make sure that your goals, especially in the short term, are realistic, because the school is also going to think, well, this guy, being gender neutral, but this guy has no idea how he or she's going to get that particular job going out, and we don't have the recruiting resources for that type of career path, so it's not realistic. So make sure that you know for the particular schools where their strengths lie in terms of recruiting, and that's going to be important too. So realism in the short-term goal, ambition in the long-term goal, but still realism going into that ambitious goal is going to be important. So what are your career goals? And by the time you're interviewing, you should know this this question like the back of your hand, and you should be excited about it. So tangentially related to this question is why school X? So if you're going to be interviewing at Wharton, why Wharton? If you're interviewing at Haas, why Haas? Questrom, why Questrom? And so forth. So make sure that you do your research up front for the school at which you're interviewing. So what are you excited about that particular school? So show not just that you know the school, but you have a level of enthusiasm about some aspect of the school that you're really excited about. Because, you know, again, well, not again, but top tier schools tend to have more qualified candidates than places in the class. So they'd rather admit, people that will attend, so people that will attend, i.e. on the yield side, are likely to be more excited about the program than those that don't show excitement. But you know, you want people in the classroom that are going to be excited about being there, right? So what are you excited about? And you should be considering this sort of question in terms of the curriculum, the classroom. Lots of curricula are similar across schools, but the nuances, and what is the nuance difference in this particular school that has you excited potentially? The extracurriculars, so what you're doing outside the classroom, fantastic. Hopefully you can sort of demonstrate that you'll be a leader at the school, and you'll take on some club leadership, and maybe help run a conference and so forth, because running conferences at schools might be the best way to get a job in a particular niche area. So you should know that, and so forth, right? In terms of recruiting, you know, what it is about that school that really aligns well with your recruiting, not forgetting that schools, even the top schools, tend to be geographically biased to their region. So what it is about that region where you want to work in some cases, and then your overall fit for the school. So if you're interviewing at TUC, TUC is in a rather unusual location versus a lot of other schools. So show them why you're excited to be in that type of learning environment. If again, TUC is a school that you're interviewing at versus interviewing, let's say, at Stern, which is, you know, in the middle of Wall Street, right? So two very different environments. Both schools absolutely want you to visit for your interview, boom, so you can get their experience and so forth. And I would say that if you're asked this question, and if you have visited, or if this interview is as a part of your visit, you lead with that. In answering. So you start off by saying, during my visit to, or during this visit, and then go on about what you learned during the visit and what's excited you, and so on and so forth. So you can really show the interviewer your enthusiasm for the school. I think that's a good approach to answering that particular question. So it would be very unusual if you're not asked some kind of leadership question for the school, and there are multiple types of leadership questions you may get asked. So again, this goes back to coming up with multiple anecdotes from your past, multiple experiences that you can then map onto one of these particular types of questions that you might get asked. And again, I would encourage you to look at, you know, again, through Clear Admit's interview archive as an example for the schools that you're applying, to get a sense of the particular questions that school likes to ask. But in terms of leadership, you might be asked to describe an example where you led without authority, right? So we know as AdCom, when you're applying, oftentimes you don't have hierarchical sort of like oversight over the people in your organization, but that presents a really interesting leadership challenge if you're running a project and you have to influence peers, and even manage up, influence those above you to move a project forward and so forth. So we all know the challenges that that does present. And that's a very fair game question, I think, for the MBA admissions thing. So describe an example where you led without authority, an example where your actions led to impact. Again, business schools really interested in people that affect impact. It's great that people do good jobs and get stuff done, but to take it to the next level, how you created impact versus someone else in that similar role really helps you stand out. Describe an example where you had to convince others of your idea. Influence, those sort of things, very important for business schools. Describe an example of managing up, and so on and so forth. And actually, the next one I'll just throw out there because it's my only anecdote related to, or only question, I guess, related to international global, which is more and more important. So I should address that more so in this. But describe an example of managing across cultures, and this sort of question would be more in line if you're applying to, let's say, London Business School or INSEAD, HEC, Paris, and ESE, and schools, the top schools in Europe and so forth, which have much more international focus in their student body. But I would say that US schools are now starting to ask more of these types of questions. So be conscious of that. Describe an example where you led, but were not a subject matter expert, right? So you had to rely on others. So sometimes you're managing a team where other members of the team are critical for you to be then successful, right? So leadership question, teamwork type questions, very important. You can consider non-work examples, make sure there's impact. And there's this sort of approach called the STAR approach, the STAR method to answering questions. And you can Google this to get much more sort of concrete information on how to organize answering these types of questions. But STAR is an acronym where you describe the situation at hand. So you describe to the interviewer the scenario, the task that you then had to accomplish, the actions that you then took, and the results of the anecdote and so forth. So you want to be results based in answering these questions so you can show your success. So sort of tangible results to a leadership experience where you were able to increase the bottom line by X, or get a project out X months on early, or whatever it might be that shows that there was success there. So the STAR approach, and there's also the CAR approach. It's sort of same sort of idea, but make sure you're familiar with those methods of answering these types of questions, and then you can write out your anecdotes using that sort of methodology so that you're ready to answer those questions. Okay, so a failure experience. This used to be my favorite question when I interviewed Wharton candidates. I would leave it to the end, and I would only ask it to the real standout candidates, because sometimes, when you're interviewing, you kind of know where the candidate fits in the scheme of things after the first 10 or 15 minutes. And, some candidates, maybe you're thinking, well, they're good candidates, but they're not, they're not necessarily the elite. So, they may not be moving forward from this interview. So I wouldn't ask this question particularly in that case. But the ones that came across, really well accomplished and polished and successful, this question always was a very interesting way to try to humble them a little bit, for one of a right thing. But I think more and more these days, people are expecting this type of question, and it's getting more commonly asked. So you want to identify a real failure in the sense that you don't want to say something like, wow, the project was running late, this, that, and the other, but we fixed it and we got it on time. So there was a little bit of a failure halfway through, but we fixed it. That doesn't count. And quite honestly, if you answer it in that sense, you're showing a pretty good sort of lack of self-awareness, and you're also telling the interviewer, I would say, that you haven't tried hard enough. If you've never failed, you've never got out of your comfort zone, you've never pushed yourself, that's not the sort of candidate that most schools are seeking. So most people have some kind of failure that they can address, they should be addressing. Make sure, though, hopefully the failure was not catastrophic to your organization. So you want to find that middle ground somewhere, whilst also showing your role, right? And being honest and being humble and so forth. So example, describe a time where your team didn't meet its goals, and etc. And your role in that and so forth. It really does help identify your self-awareness, and self-awareness is very important. Again, part of sort of the emotional intelligence that we're seeking now in MBA candidates. It identifies your humility. Humility, again, is really important. You know, you get the stereotypical, oh, MBAs are, you know, A-type and they're go-getters and this, that, and the other. And actually, what you find when you actually get to know these people, they're actually pretty cool people too, which is good. But a sense of humility is very important. And this question also allows you to demonstrate your growth, your ability to learn, so that you talk about the experience in which there was a failure, your role in that failure, what you learned from that failure, and then you can address a subsequent experience that shows that you did actually learn it. So, and this brings up another point. Always when you're addressing these questions, you want to show, not tell, right? So you want to show by example rather than saying, I learned from it. You show how you learned from it by providing subsequent answer to that question. So a related question to this would be, tell me your weaknesses. You might even be asked, tell me your strengths and your weaknesses, or something like that. But again, addressing your weaknesses, hopefully they're weaknesses where you can show personal growth and grow from those weaknesses. Personal traits like I have little tolerance for dumb people is probably not a weakness you want to put out there. But nevertheless, there are definitely plenty of weaknesses that would be fair game, and show that you're actually trying to overcome those weaknesses by whatever steps that you're taking. And maybe the weaknesses has been identified in a performance review or something like that. So your mentor, your manager is helping you work through that weakness. And again, you can show growth from it. So what are other schools you're applying? This is a nasty, nasty question. And I do actually think it's getting asked more and more than it was in the day that I was interviewing. And you don't really know why they're asking this question. And they'll tell you they're asking because it's a marketing exercise on their part. They just want to know who their peer schools are and so forth. But quite honestly, I don't really buy that, because they should know who their peer schools are. We certainly know who their peer schools are because we've got all that data from Decision Wire and so forth. So if they really want to know who their peer schools are, they can just ask us. But nevertheless, a lot of us suspect the real reason is they want to know if you'll attend the program, if you're going to get admitted, right? How do you answer this question? Well, fundamentally, you've got to be honest, because ethics is very important thing that we look at. So being honest, although I will tell you that there's no way they can check this stuff. So it's not like schools can swap data and say, well, Joe Smith's applying to us, so there you go. So, but nevertheless, be honest, because you take the high ground and be honest, but be thoughtful, right? So when you talk about the other schools you're applying, you want to provide rational reasons why you picked, these 4 or 5 schools. That would be very good. So be thoughtful. So you didn't just apply to the top programs, but you applied to programs that focused on X, Y, and Z to help you with your career goals and so on and so forth. Make good sense of all that. Then explain why the school to which you're interviewing is a great fit for you. And if you've already explained that in your why the school question, just reaffirm that, but show that you still have enthusiasm no matter who else you've applied to, right? So that's probably the best way to address that question. Describe a conflict at work. So this can be challenging. Again, kind of like the failure question, you want to come up with a real conflict. Don't come up with something that really was a matter of nothing. So the conflict inherently is a disagreement with you, your boss, you and peers at work, or whatever it might be. Disagree with the team member or manager over a project that you're undertaking. and so forth. And there might be some real valid reasons for those disagreements, right? And some misunderstandings, etc. How did you then work to a positive outcome? So try to pick a conflict that has a positive outcome to it, not something where eventually someone had to leave the organization because you couldn't get along anymore. That probably wouldn't be a good scenario to address. And certainly don't throw a colleague under the bus. That doesn't go say much for your emotional intelligence and your ability to work on a team, because a good team player is also someone that can work with people that are dysfunctional on a team, right? So making sure that you can do all that and so forth. Don't downplay your role. Again, in the same as the failure question, it attends to your emotional intelligence. And then what did you learn from this experience? Again, back to the failure question and the leadership question. What did you learn from this experience? And how has that been applied in subsequent experiences? If there's a subsequent experience, you can then draw from that shows growth on your part. It's fantastic if you can do that. So describe a conflict at work. What concerns do you have about the MBA? This is kind of a tough question, I suppose. It's not really one that's often asked. But nevertheless, you should be prepared for it. And I would say, what is the concern is, you're planning to invest 2 years, one in some cases 2 years of your life in sort of this sort of professional development, as it were, or academic development, or a mix between the both. And the financial cost and opportunity costs are significant. So there's some risk there. So that can be the sort of general premise of the concern. I think for non-traditional candidates that are coming from less traditional careers, you could address this concern more with a bit more sort of passion, I suppose. But then you want to show the steps that you've taken to try to mitigate the concern, to feel good about it yourself, right? So show that the AdCom, despite your concerns, you have done the research that you still feel comfortable going ahead with this decision. I would say that this question may start appearing more often now with international students who are going to a different country, obviously if they're international students, to do an MBA and planning to relocate, whether it's to relocate to Europe or to the US or wherever it might be post their MBA. With the current sort of immigration climate, obviously that sort of affects this group of candidates, and it's a legitimate concern then. And again, for those candidates, I'd say just make sure you've got a good plan B, and that you can legitimize returning back to your country after pursuing the MBA, and that as a plan B still makes sense, and you feel comfortable with that, because at the end of the day, again, the MBA program doesn't want to admit you and then find out at some point that you're not going to attend because of whatever concerns that you might have. Okay, how would those close to you describe you in 3 words? Again, sort of quite a commonly used question, I suppose, and there are multiple variants. You might be asked in 5 words, it might be specific to your colleagues or your friends or your family or whatever it might be. So I would ask those groups of people to identify those 3 words. Hopefully they're positive words. Ambitious, entrepreneurial, vivacious, or whatever it might be. Hopefully 3 very positive words. Hopefully they're somewhat complementary, somewhat sort of wide focus in terms of addressing 2 or 3 different attributes about you, but back up each response with examples. So again, your show, not tell, right? So you're being assertive with some substance there. Is going to be important. So you want to be able to basically defend the three words, make sure that those words are positive also, which of course you will, right? How will you take advantage of our resources? So this question is actually very similar to the, why are you applying to Wharton and why are you applying to HASS, that sort of why school question. But I would suggest this question is a bit more involving in terms of they really want to know that you have done your research and you really know the school. So if your why response doesn't pass muster, this sort of question might come as a follow-up. And if you haven't done your research on the curriculum, on the extracurricular activities, on the recruiting side of it, then you might run into a bit of trouble. So it's a bit of a nuanced version, but a bit more detailed for the schools that really want to know if you've done your research for their particular program. So do your research ahead of time. Show the interview you really understand why it makes sense to be there. And then this question, people you remember the most break the rules, do you agree? And whilst this particular question might not be that common, this question is quite interesting in as much as it gets to my first point. Always listen carefully to the questions asked. And I say this because an easy way to deny a candidate is if they didn't respond to the question. And, you know, people you remember the most break the rules. Do you agree? In the first instance, it makes you think, well, that's all about innovation, entrepreneurship, boom, boom, boom. You know, notable people that have done that, Bill Gates and, you know, the Apple guy, and I forgot his name. That's terrible, isn't it? But you know who I mean, all these extraordinary people. So innovation is good. So yeah, you remember them, and that's fantastic. But highlighting people that break rules, probably not such a good thing in the environment of the financial crisis and the crash and other ethical issues that have occurred. And some would then blame those issues on MBAs and so on and so forth. And you've read all the press about this stuff. So when you're answering a question like this, changing rules is good. So you have to lobby and get rules changed if is not so good, and that's where people end up into trouble, right? So this is a good question just to illustrate this idea of always listen carefully to whichever question you're receiving, and don't worry if you have a bit of a pause as you gather your thoughts to answer questions, right? So that's absolutely going to be fair game. And then finally, in terms of the general questions, you should get a question at the end. What questions do you have for me? And you want to make sure that you have 2 or 3 questions prepared of the time that you have left for the interview, right? And try to be sort of smart about you thinking, is the interview being rushed? Does she have 4 other people waiting and she's on a half-an-hour schedule? Again, at the Hub City interviews that I used to conduct a lot of, that was always the case. So you don't want to be asking questions just to fill in time. In that case, you know, in the Hub interview where it's very tight, you might just come up with 1 question and then thank the interviewer very much and be gracious and so on and so forth, right? But have prepared 2 or 3 questions. Don't ask questions that can be easily answered. Google is a fantastic thing these days. You have access to pretty much lots of stuff. So do your research first. Don't be asking a stupid question. That will really irritate your interviewer. Don't put the interviewer on the defensive. When you get admitted to a program and you go to their welcome events and so on and so forth, you can ask challenging questions. But at this stage, you want the interviewer to like you. You don't want to put them in an uncomfortable situation that they can't answer the question, or they're having to defend something about the school that you read in the press, or a drop in a ranking, or whatever it might be that puts the interviewer on the defensive. That's a bad thing. You want the interviewer not only to be impressed by you, but to like you. And quite honestly, being likable is a very important trait or characteristic or whatever that you want to as part of the overall impression of the interviewer. So don't put the interviewer on the defensive. If it's a student or alum, I think your best bet is ask about his or her experiences directly. And people like to talk about their experiences. You've just spent 20 minutes, 25, 30 minutes or whatever, talking about your experiences. Hopefully you've had a good time doing that in the interview. Let the interviewer do that about his or her experiences. And that's something unique to that person that you can't find through Google. So it's a very good, fair game set of questions. If it's AdCom, like myself, when I was interviewing, maybe ask vision-related questions about the school. So where do you see the school in 5 years? I hear there's a new program in this. What do you think about that? And so on and so forth. So perhaps more vision-related in that regard. So that's about preparing for interviewers, questions that you might have. Okay, so those of you who are applying to Wharton or interviewing at Wharton, and this next slide is based off of previous years' team-based discussions. So I say that because Wharton may change their approach from year to year, although they've kept a pretty similar approach over the last 2 or 3 years. So they seem to be quite happy with it. So as an interviewee, I should say, you should have been sent out a question, and I don't actually know what that question is, to be perfectly honest, but it might be something regarding setting up a new student club or something at Wharton that sort of helps highlight why Wharton is cool, but shows then how you can then add value to Wharton. So that's kind of been the approach that they've used over the last couple of years. So when you get that topic, do your research on that topic to the extent that you can, without going absolutely crazy about it. But obviously do your topic research. That'd be very good. Now, arrive early. And for any interview, I'd say arrive early, because you want to take the stress out of getting to your interview location, right? But in this case, arrive earlier, because during the time you're waiting to conduct your team-based interview, you get to know and chat with your peers and others that are potentially going to be in that same team, right? So it's good to get some of that out of the way. So it makes you a more cohesive team, potentially, if you know a little bit about your teammates, right? So arrive early, get to know your team. Fantastic. Okay, so this year's you'll get to present your idea. Be succinct. Take 60 seconds. Don't ramble on. And we see feedback on our interview archive where people have rambled on and this, that, and the other, and it's just not going to be very effective, right? So do your topic research and be prepared to present your idea in a succinct fashion in 60 seconds. And then you'll all get to chat about stuff, right? And get ready to present as a group. Don't try to just dominate the team discussion. Speak with substance. Speak with when something meaningful needs to be said. Be cognizant that all the team speaks. So you might be the guy on the team that brings out the shyer person and asks that person directly what they think and ask for them about their ideas. So that would be very good. Be very time conscious. So you'll be set time limits and make sure there's a timekeeper to make sure that you do things effectively. And there's potentially going to be some disagreements. So don't all just agree because you want to sound like the nice person agreeing. If there's a reason why you want to provide a counterpoint, provide that counterpoint. But you want to try to avoid sort of open warfare, right, and real conflict. But providing counterpoints and opportunities for additional discussion has to be a good thing. And whiteboard it, be authentic, and hopefully everything will be all right. And as after the team-based discussion, you will then get an opportunity to sit one-on-one with a second-year student, I think, in most cases, and have your one-on-one interview. In this case, it's going to be a shortened interview. Won't be the full 30 minutes or 45 minutes that traditional interviews are. And sometimes the interviewer will focus on, how do you think the team-based discussion went, so you can provide feedback on that. Other times they'll be focused on, why MBA, why Wharton, what your goals are, and tell us a little bit about yourself. So be prepared to answer both lines of questions in that regard. Okay, so Ross has a team exercise that's optional versus required, or at least it had been optional up until this year, so I presume it's going to be the same. And I'd say in this case, do it if you can. But I do think Ross's team-based exercise is less impactful in the admissions decision than Wharton's team-based discussion, which is required. And without, saying anything negative, I'd say more so the Ross team-based exercise is probably a bit more of a marketing PR exercise on the part of Ross to show what a cool place it is, versus an evaluative tool for Ross to determine who to admit. But that being said, you will be observed by second-year students, so don't be an idiot. Otherwise, you'll be called out for it. So be reasonable and enjoy it. But all the feedback that we see on our site is it's a great experience, a lot of fun. We enjoyed it. Again, they've had different variants of how they do this over the 2 or 3 years that they've done it, but they basically give you some random words and ask you to create a business idea, a solution, a problem, whatever it might be, and then present it, show that you're a good team player. You'll be in a group of 5 or 6 students. You'll have a group presentation and some kind of follow-up question to show that then you can react and respond as a group. So you'll be observed by second-year students. So they're really the 2 schools that have these sort of team-focused exercises. Additional twists, Harvard asks you within 24 hours to follow up from the interview and basically ask you how it went. I think this is absolutely fantastic. And if I was designing an admissions process from scratch, I would absolutely include this in the evaluation process, because I really do think it gives the student the last say on admissions, and I think it's a very good thing, and so forth. So if you as you do the follow up, obviously you're gracious in the opportunity to interview at Harvard, as anyone should be. You address a few anecdotes in the follow up. You provide some kind of positive affirmation that you're excited to go to the school, and so forth. So I think this is a very good thing that Harvard does. I also think there are some schools starting to lean towards doing this. So MIT Sloan might actually have language now in their admissions encouraging people to follow up after the interview without necessarily requiring it. I forget if that's the case, but I seem to remember reading that thinking, yes, that's they're following down that path. MIT has a pre-interview essay, or at least it has in the past. And if that is the case, and I believe it's still the case, then that essay itself may be good sort of opening fodder for that particular interview. So if you're having to do something prior to the interview, recognize that might be the opening line of questioning for the interview itself. London Business School does something really interesting, I think, in terms of asking you to do a case presentation, provides you a scenario, gives you some time to think about it, and then you present for 5 minutes. And I think it's a fantastic way to really get a measure of your communication skills. So kudos to LBS for doing that. Hopefully the case presentations that you give require sort of minimal sort of knowledge of specific niche areas, but it allows you to sort of then show your presentation. So I think that's quite a good thing. INSEAD, you do 2 interviews with 2 different alums, so just be aware of that. And actually, I was kind of feeling a little bit not lost, but I didn't really know the interview process for schools like ISB and SEEBS and so forth. So I was Googling around this morning to see what those schools do, and certainly ISB, you might be interviewed by more than one person at the same time, right? So kind of like an interview panel thing. So just be prepared and aware of that. And then sort of finally, sort of additional twists. More and more schools are using video interviews, not necessarily to replace the live interview, but as an adjunct to really get a sense, again, of your communication skills before they meet you directly in the interview. So these are slightly different, and there are various ways to prepare for them, but make sure the tech works. So hopefully, as in this webinar, the tech works. So don't let that get in the way. And these sort of interviews show your ability to think on your feet. You're answering specific questions, not sort of why you're applying to the school necessarily, but maybe talking about some sort of I don't know, general knowledge type issue or so forth. But if you're applying to a school that does this, then there's plenty of information online that you can use to sort of help you prepare for those types of interviews. Okay, so that's it. Hopefully it's given a reasonably sort of broad brush thing for you in terms of preparing for your interview, your weakness, this, that, and the other. I will now take questions from you. Like I have the Q&A box and the chat box wide open for anyone that wants to ask any additional questions. Excuse me. I'll be here for another 10 minutes. If not, if you're done, feel free to leave. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you've been able to learn a few things, or if not, I hope it's sort of reaffirmed what you thought the interviews were about, and you feel a bit more confident now going into your interviews because you feel like you're well prepared. You know, the schools aren't interviewing you to try to trip you up deliberately or anything like that. They seriously just want to know if you're the right fit for the school, if you'll attend the school, and if you can accomplish those two things, you go a very long way. So best of luck, and like I say, I'll now answer any questions directly. So I'm looking in the chat box. Do you have some tips for international students applying for Emory? Wow, that's a very specific question. But you know, Emory again is a top, you know, very, very good school, top 20 school, I would say, you know, in that regard, you have to be accomplished. Their particular interviewing style, I don't think, is anything extraordinary in terms of, I believe it's a blind interview, so it's kind of rehashing the sort of materials that you addressed in your essays and so on and so forth. Show that you're passionate about Emory, show you're passionate about potentially working in Atlanta, because that's obviously their stomping ground. So that would be a very good thing to do. Let me see, what else do we have?
So Alex, we have a question that was from a little earlier that had to do with HEC Paris.
Yeah.
Their interview includes a 10-minute oral presentation on the topic of a candidate's choice. Do you have any insights on which topic to select or any suggestions?
For something like that, and again, it's kind of a similar thing that LBS has, and I'm sorry I didn't include all variants from all schools, but nevertheless, I think this kind of approach is very interesting because, again, it gets to your communication skills. You're going to be doing a bunch of presentations in school, so it makes sense to ask candidates to do presentations to see how they react in that environment. What I would try to do is pick a topic that you're passionate about, because again, I think passion really comes through very well if you can do that. So for me, I would pick something about horses or horse racing or horse welfare and so forth. Try to tie it to some degree in terms of business school. But what I wouldn't pick is political topics, something that's divisive, and so forth, because you know that could just rub someone the wrong way, right? So you just don't want to do that. So pick something that's not going to be divisive. Try to pick something that you're passionate about, something that you're eloquent about, and something that you will enjoy presenting. I think that would be your best way to go. Yeah. Okay, so I'm reading this. Thanks for. Would failing to meet my goal time in a marathon be suitable anecdote as a failure, or should I come up with something in my profession? Well, that's kind of an interesting thing. It depends, Jonathan, in terms of how impactful that failure was, I would say, and what did it then make you do subsequently, right? So, you know, if you ran a marathon and you didn't meet your goal, which I did actually once. I ran the New York Marathon, ran it in 4.5 hours. I thought I was going to run it in about 3.5 hours. So clearly I didn't meet my goal. But what did I do as a result of that? I quit running marathons. So probably for me, that wouldn't be a good failure to address, right? But if it then sent you on a path to be more focused about achieving goals and so on and so forth, that you can then come back and say, this is what I did and this is what I accomplished subsequent to that, then maybe it becomes more fair game, right? So just making sure that you pick a failure that really has some substance behind it, that you can then sort of show that you grew from, I'd say is a good answer to that. Can you tell me something about Marshall and UCI? Any advice? Well, I can tell you that they're on the West Coast rather than on the East Coast. No, sorry, that's a stupid answer. But I would say, you know, if your career goal is related to working in Southern California, these would be very good options, right? Relative to going to maybe a school that's got a bit of a higher profile, but is not in the West Coast in Southern California. I would look at their career reports and see specifically where they're placing people. But, you know, Marshall has a very good program that's related to not only Southern California, but then the sort of I think what you call the Asia Pacific region or whatever, and so on and so forth. But do your research. I can give you little anecdotes about these schools, but you can spend lots of time really learning about these schools, particularly based on a lot of information online. So I would go that route too. But certainly if your career goals are based in Southern California, then clearly those schools would be on my radar to be exploring, versus, like I say, maybe a bit more high profile school, but you know, on the East Coast. They just don't have the same alumni network, the same connections and so forth. Okay, did I miss any questions or so forth? Mike, do you see any additional questions that I might have missed? Or if anyone wants to throw in a quick question as we wrap up?
The only one I see is how can you best address a low GMAT score?
Okay.
Besides the obvious of retaking a low GMAT, you know, you can always take that test again. But I guess, is there a way in the interview organically you can bring that up and try to address that with the AdCom?
Yeah, you might be asked. I mean, again, if you've been invited to interview as a result of your application, then they already have moved you forward despite the lower GMAT score. But you may be asked directly in the interview about a weakness, and then that would be fair game to bring up the GMAT score as an example of a weakness, I suppose. And there are various ways to address it. One is obviously if you can retake the test, but then at this stage of the interview, it sort of becomes a bit of a moot point at that stage. But, you know, if you've taken additional coursework that shows that the GMAT or test scores are not your thing, that might be quite helpful. At the end of the day, the school wants to know that you will thrive academically in their environment, not that you will survive. Those are two different things. If you're just surviving, then you're not going to be able to get involved in the extracurriculars, your recruiting's not going to be good, and so on and so forth, because you're going to be spending all your time getting by in the classroom. They want people that are going to do well in the classroom so that they can also get involved in lots of other things. So if your test scores are not your thing, you're going to have to prove that in other avenues like additional coursework and stuff. And different schools are obviously going to take this issue you know, potentially in different ways. Okay, I think that's what we have. I do think I saw a question earlier if this will be available as a recording and so forth, and I believe it will be. Mike will take care of all that stuff, so you can review it, you can get the slide deck and so forth. You can, I'm always on the social tools that ClearAdmit has, like Livewire and ApplyWire and DecisionWire, answering questions. So I wish you the best of luck interviewing and going, you know, getting admitted to school, but that, and go on and, you know, help change, you know, so